I'm Sarah, and this is the story of how my life took an unexpected turn. Growing up in Millbrook, a tiny speck on the map that most people have never heard of, I always dreamed of something bigger. Don't get me wrong, Millbrook had its charms, everybody knew everybody, and the annual fall festival was the highlight of our year. But for an ambitious girl like me, it felt suffocating. My parents, Tom and Lisa Thompson, worked hard to give me everything, but they were modest folks who never flaunted their wealth. Money doesn't define a person, Sarah, Dad would always say. It's what you do with it that matters. I was their only child, and they poured all their love and hopes into me. Mom would spend hours helping me with my homework, while Dad taught me the value of hard work by letting me help out at the plant during summers. They were simple people with big hearts, and I loved them for it. But Millbrook was too small for me, so after graduating from high school, I went to college in another city. The 4 years at Westbrook flew by in a blur of classes, part-time jobs, and newfound friendships. I threw myself into my studies, determined to make the most of this opportunity. Graduation day arrived before I knew it. As I stood in my cap and gown, diploma in hand, I caught sight of my parents in the crowd. Dad was beaming with pride, and Mom was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I'd done it, I was a college graduate, ready to take on the world. But the real world had other plans. The job market was tough, and despite my degree, I found myself struggling to land a position in my field. After weeks of rejections, I finally got an offer as a secretary assistant at Global Trade Incorporated, a large trading company in the heart of the city. It's not exactly what I studied for, I told my parents over the phone, trying to hide my disappointment. It's a foot in the door, Sarah, Dad reassured me. You've got to start somewhere. Work hard, and opportunities will come. 6 months into my job at Global Trade Incorporated, I had settled into a comfortable routine. Wake up, commute, work, commute, sleep, repeat. It wasn't exactly the glamorous city life I'd imagined, but it was a start. Then, on a particularly dreary Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. I was grabbing a quick coffee at the cafe across from our office building when I quite literally bumped into him. Hot coffee splashed across my blouse, and I let out a yelp of surprise. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," a deep voice exclaimed. I looked up to see a pair of striking green eyes filled with concern. The man they belonged to was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with dark hair and a chiseled jawline. He looked like he'd stepped right out of a magazine cover. "It's fine," I mumbled, trying to dab at the stain with a napkin. "It's just a shirt." "Please, let me buy you another coffee," he insisted. "And your dry cleaning bill. I feel terrible." I was about to refuse when he flashed a charming smile that made my knees weak. "I'm Mark, by the way. Mark Callahan." "Sarah Thompson," I replied, returning his smile. "And okay, you can buy me coffee. But let's skip the dry cleaning drama." We ended up talking for over an hour. Mark was a rising star at a prestigious law firm, charming, funny, and impossibly easy to talk to. By the time I realized I was late getting back to work, we'd already exchanged numbers and made plans for dinner that weekend. Our first date was like something out of a romantic comedy. Mark took me to an exclusive rooftop restaurant with a view of the entire city skyline. The food was exquisite, the wine flowed freely, and the conversation never lagged. As we stood on the terrace afterwards, the city lights twinkling below us, Mark leaned in and kissed me. It was perfect. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of romantic dates, late-night phone calls, and stolen moments between our busy work schedules. Mark was attentive, generous, and seemed to genuinely care about my thoughts and dreams. As our relationship deepened, I found myself spending more and more time at Mark's luxurious downtown apartment. It was a far cry from my tiny studio, with its sleek modern furniture and state-of-the-art appliances. Sometimes I felt out of place among all the opulence, but Mark always made me feel welcome. 1 year into our relationship, on a weekend getaway to a quaint bed and breakfast in the countryside, Mark got down on one knee and proposed. The ring was enormous, a diamond that caught the light and sparkled like a star. Sarah Thompson, you brought so much joy and love into my life, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. Will you marry me? For a moment, I was speechless. This was everything I'd ever dreamed of, a handsome, successful man who loved me, offering a life of comfort and security. I pushed the doubts aside and nodded, tears streaming down my face. Yes, Mark. Yes, I'll marry you. As he slipped the ring onto my finger and pulled me into a passionate kiss, I felt like I was floating on air. This was the beginning of my happily ever after, wasn't it? The excitement of our engagement was still fresh when Mark suggested we visit my parents. I want to meet the people who raised such an amazing woman, he said with that charming smile of his. We planned the trip for the following weekend. As we drove into Millbrook, I pointed out familiar landmarks to Mark. The high school where I'd spent my teenage years, the diner where I'd had my first job as a waitress. Mark nodded politely, but I could see his eyes scanning the modest houses and small businesses with a hint of disdain. We pulled up to the apartment complex, where my parents rented an apartment during the renovation of their house. As we climbed the stairs to my parents' temporary home, I could feel Mark's judgment radiating off him in waves. Mom opened the door before we could knock, her face lighting up with a warm smile. Sarah, honey, she exclaimed, pulling me into a tight hug. She turned to Mark, her smile never faltering. And you must be Mark. We've heard so much about you. Dad appeared behind her, extending his hand to Mark. Welcome, son. Come on in. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the familiar knickknacks and family photos that made it feel like home, despite its temporary nature. I watched nervously as Mark's eyes swept over the modest furnishings and cramped space. As we sat down to eat, the conversation flowed awkwardly. Mark spoke about his job at the law firm, dropping names of high-profile clients and mentioning the expensive car he'd recently purchased. My parents listened politely, exchanging glances I couldn't quite decipher. So, Tom, Mark said, turning to my father. What line of work are you in? Dad swallowed a mouthful of food before answering. I work at a wood processing plant just outside of town. He did not specify his position, true to his modest nature. Ah, Mark nodded, a hint of condescension in his voice. That must be interesting work. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, though I wasn't sure if it was on behalf of my parents or Mark. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of stilted conversation and uncomfortable silences. As we drove back to the city, Mark was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke. Your parents seem nice. But they're just very simple people. I guess I thought, with you being so polished and all, that they might be different. I opened my mouth to defend my parents, to explain about the renovations, about Dad's business. But something stopped me. A part of me wanted to see how Mark would treat us, if he thought we came from humble beginnings. A few days after our visit to Millbrook, Mark announced that his mother wanted to meet me. She's eager to get to know the woman who's stolen my heart, he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I was nervous as we pulled up to a towering apartment building in the most exclusive part of the city. Mark's mother, Vivian Callahan, lived in the penthouse suite. As the elevator climbed to the top floor, my stomach churned with anxiety. The doors opened directly into a foyer that was larger than my entire apartment. Vivian stood there, a statuesque woman in her early 60s, impeccably dressed in what I assumed was a designer outfit. Mark, darling, she cooed, air-kissing both his cheeks. Then she turned her piercing gaze on me. And you must be Sarah. I extended my hand. It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Callahan. She looked at my hand for a moment before taking it briefly. Vivian, please. Mrs. Callahan makes me sound so old. The next hour was a whirlwind of designer names I didn't recognize and artwork I couldn't begin to appreciate. Vivian led us through her apartment, pointing out various luxurious items and name-dropping her influential friends. Finally, we settled in the living room. Vivian perched on an antique chaise lounge, while Mark and I sat on a sofa that probably cost more than my yearly salary. So, Sarah, Vivian began, her voice saccharine sweet. Mark tells me you work as a secretary? I nodded. Yes, I'm a secretary assistant at Global Trade Incorporated. How quaint, Vivian said, her tone making it clear she thought it was anything but. And where did you say you were from, dear? Millbrook, I replied. It's a small town about 2 hours from here. Vivian's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose. Well, I must say, this is quite unexpected. Mark, surely you can see that this arrangement might not be suitable. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. Before I could respond, Mark jumped in. Mother, please, he said, his voice tight. I love Sarah. We're getting married. Vivian let out a dramatic sigh. Well, if you insist. When is the wedding? I'll need time to plan a suitable celebration. The Astoria ballroom would be perfect, don't you think? We could invite all the right people. Actually, I interrupted, finding my voice at last. We were thinking of something more intimate. Maybe a small ceremony in Hawaii, just the two of us. Vivian stood abruptly. Hawaii? Without guests? Without me? I think I need a moment, she said coldly, leaving the room. Mark turned to me, his expression a mix of frustration and disapproval. Maybe we can find a compromise? Something that makes everyone happy? Finally, we reached a compromise. We would have our ceremony in Hawaii as planned, but we'd allow Vivian to attend and document the event for her social media. It wasn't ideal, but it seemed like the best way to keep the peace. 4 months after that tense meeting with Vivian, Mark and I found ourselves on a beautiful Hawaiian beach, ready to say our vows. The setting was perfect, golden sand, crystal clear water, and a breathtaking sunset. But the moment was somewhat marred by Vivian's constant presence, her phone always at the ready to capture every moment. The ceremony itself was beautiful, despite Vivian's interruptions. As we exchanged vows, I felt a surge of love for Mark, remembering why I'd agreed to all this in the first place. After the ceremony, Mark pulled me aside. I have something for you, he said, his eyes twinkling. He handed me a small, elegantly wrapped box. Inside was the latest model smartphone, sleek and expensive. Now you'll always be in touch, Mark said with a grin. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the pang of disappointment. It was a generous gift, but it felt impersonal, especially for a wedding present. Thank you, I said, giving him a kiss. I have something for you too. I handed him a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a painting I'd done myself, depicting the two of us on our first date, overlooking the city skyline. I'd spent weeks working on it in secret. Mark's expression was hard to read as he looked at the painting. It's nice, he said finally. Very thoughtful. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of hurt at his lukewarm response. But before I could dwell on it, Vivian swooped in, insisting on more photos. When we returned home, I hoped things would settle into a peaceful routine. For a while, they did. Our life together was filled with love, laughter, and the excitement of building a future together. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice changes. Vivian's influence seemed to grow stronger, even from a distance. She called constantly, and even show up unannounced, critique my housekeeping, and often film her inspections to send to Mark. When I tried to talk to Mark about it, he just shrugged. That's just how Mother is, he said. You need to be softer with her. She means well. Weeks passed, and I found myself increasingly involved in Global Trade Incorporated's operations. One day, our company was on the verge of signing a critically important contract with an Italian firm. As I sat in on the meeting, taking notes as usual, I noticed our hired translator struggling with the complex business terminology. The Italian executives were growing visibly frustrated, and I could see the deal slipping away. Without thinking, I stood up and addressed the room in fluent Italian.
Signori, permettetemi di chiarire alcuni punti.
I said, smoothly explaining the finer details of our proposal. The room fell silent, all eyes on me. For the next hour, I facilitated the negotiations, switching effortlessly between English and Italian. By the end, we had not only salvaged the deal, but secured even better terms than initially proposed. As the Italian executives left, clearly impressed, my boss, Mr. Johnson, pulled me aside. "Sarah, I had no idea you spoke Italian," he said, his eyes wide with surprise. I smiled sheepishly. "I actually know several languages. I have a degree in international business with a focus on linguistics." Mr. Johnson's eyebrows shot up. "Why on earth are you working as a secretary?" I shrugged, not wanting to get into the complexities of my personal life. It was the position available when I applied. The next morning, I arrived at work to find Mr. Johnson waiting for me. "Sarah, I've been reviewing your file," he said. "Your qualifications are impressive. I'd like to offer you a position as my assistant, with a 2-month probationary period. What do you say?" I was stunned. Yes, of course. Thank you, Mr. Johnson." As I settled into my new role, I felt a surge of pride and excitement. Finally, I was using my skills and education to their full potential. That evening, I rushed home, eager to share my good news. "Mark, you won't believe what happened today," I began, launching into the story of the Italian deal and my promotion. To my disappointment, Mark's reaction was lukewarm at best. "That's nice, dear," he said, his attention barely leaving his phone. "But are you sure you want to take on more responsibility at work?" Before I could respond, Vivian's voice cut in. She had let herself in again, unannounced. "A promotion? How suspicious. I wonder what you did to earn that." I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment. "I earned it through hard work and skill, Vivian. Nothing more." She huffed, clearly unconvinced. "We'll see about that." A few days later, I was in the middle of a staff meeting when a commotion erupted in the office. To my horror, I saw Vivian striding through the cubicles, her sharp eyes darting around. 1, 2, 3, she counted loudly, pointing at my male colleagues. "My goodness, Sarah, you're practically drowning in testosterone here." My coworkers stared in shocked silence as Vivian made her way to Mr. Johnson's office. She peered in, then turned to address the room. "Well, at least the boss is old. Though that doesn't always stop some women, does it?" I felt my carefully constructed professional image crumbling around me. "That's enough," I snapped, my voice shaking with anger. "You need to leave. Now." As security escorted Vivian out, I turned to face my colleagues, their expressions a mix of pity and curiosity. I had never felt so humiliated in my life. The opportunity to escape the suffocating atmosphere at home came unexpectedly when Mr. Johnson asked me to accompany him on a business trip to a neighboring city. We were negotiating a merger with another company, and he wanted me there to assist with the details. The negotiations were intense but exhilarating. After a particularly productive day, our team decided to celebrate with a business dinner at a local restaurant. As we left the restaurant, laughing and discussing our progress, I noticed something odd. A car seemed to be following us, keeping its distance, but always in sight. A chill ran down my spine. "Is everything okay, Sarah?" one of my colleagues asked, noticing my discomfort. I hesitated, not wanting to seem paranoid. "I'm not sure. Would you mind walking me back to the hotel?" As we approached the hotel entrance, the car that had been following us suddenly pulled up. To my horror, Mark and Vivian stepped out, their faces contorted with anger. "I knew it!" Vivian shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at me. "Look at her, gallivanting around with other men." Mark stood there, his face a mask of hurt and betrayal. "How could you, Sarah?" I tried to calm them down, acutely aware of the scene we were causing. "Please, let's discuss this privately. You're embarrassing yourselves." Vivian's eyes flashed dangerously. "Embarrassing ourselves? You're the embarrassment. Just wait until I tell your parents about your behavior. They'll see what kind of daughter they've raised." The next day, as I tried to focus on our final negotiations, my phone buzzed with a call from my mother. Her voice was a mix of amusement and exasperation as she recounted what had happened. Apparently, Vivian had shown up at their rented apartment, demanding to speak to my parents about Mike's shameful behavior. My mother, ever the quick thinker, had directed Vivian to the wood processing plant where my father was overseeing a new production line. "You should have seen her face when she saw your father in his work clothes, covered in sawdust," my mother chuckled. "She looked like she'd bitten into a lemon." My father, playing his part perfectly, had apologized for not being able to shake her hand, showing her his dirty, calloused palms. Vivian had recoiled in disgust. She muttered something about wasting her time in this backwater and stormed off. My mother finished. "I think she believes your father is just a common worker at the plant." I thanked my mother for the call and hung up, fuming at Vivian. I returned home from the business trip, emotionally drained and dreading the confrontation that awaited me. As I walked through the door, I found Vivian and Mark waiting for me, their faces a mix of disdain and false pity. Vivian approached me, her voice dripping with condescension. "Sarah, dear, I've had a revelation. I now understand that we can't expect good breeding from you, not when your father is just a common worker with such dirty hands." She paused, taking a theatrical breath and arranging her face into an expression of humble concern. "My heart just aches for Mark. He deserves so much better." To my shock and disappointment, Mark stepped forward and embraced his mother. "It's okay, Mother. I'm sorry about Sarah's parents. They're just at a different level of development than us." Something snapped inside me. I'd endured months of criticism, manipulation, and disrespect, but this was the final straw. "If I'm so beneath your standards," I said, my voice shaking with anger, "then perhaps we should divorce. Clearly, I'm not the ideal wife you're looking for." Vivian's eyes lit up at my words. "What a splendid idea," she exclaimed, not even trying to hide her glee. I turned to Mark, hoping to see some sign of protest or regret in his eyes. Instead, he just nodded lazily, as if we were discussing something as trivial as what to have for dinner. Without another word, I pulled out my phone and called my mother. "Mom," I said, my voice breaking slightly, "it's over. They want a divorce." "Oh, honey," my mother sighed, her voice a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I can't say I'm surprised. Your father and I are leaving right now. Pack your things and wait for us." As I moved to our bedroom to pack, Vivian followed close behind, her eyes hawk-like as she monitored every item I placed in my suitcase. "That blouse was a gift from Mark," she'd say, or "those earrings belong to our family." I didn't bother arguing. I packed only what I'd brought into the marriage, leaving behind all the expensive gifts and designer clothes that had never felt like me anyway. By the time I heard my parents' car pull up outside, I was ready to leave. As I wheeled my suitcase to the elevator, Mark and Vivian followed, clearly eager to see me go. In the parking lot, I saw my parents' old, beat-up car, the one they kept for sentimental reasons. Mark and Vivian burst into laughter at the sight. "Look at that wreck," Vivian cackled. "It'll probably break down before they make it home." I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to reveal the truth about my family's financial situation. Instead, I watched as my father calmly stepped out of the car, holding a manila envelope. "These are the divorce papers," he said, his voice steady as he handed them to Mark. "You'll find everything in order." Mark's smug smile never faltered as he signed the papers without even reading them. He probably thought he was getting the better end of the deal. As I climbed into the back seat of my parents' car, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, anger, and underneath it all, a growing sense of freedom. The morning after my return to my parents' home, my phone rang. It was Mark, his voice cold and demanding. "I want my wedding gift back," he said without preamble. "The phone I gave you. Return it immediately." I was stunned by his pettiness, but quickly composed myself. "Sure, Mark. I'd be happy to return it. But you'll have to come and get it yourself. I'll text you the address." That evening, I watched from the window as Mark's expensive car pulled up in front of my parents' mansion. He and Vivian stepped out, their jaws dropping as they took in the sprawling estate before them. I couldn't help but chuckle at their confusion. They stood there for several minutes, clearly trying to reconcile what they were seeing with their preconceived notions about my family. Finally, my parents and I emerged from the house, purposely ignoring our unexpected guests. Dad casually pressed a button on his key fob, and the massive garage doors slid open, revealing 3 luxury vehicles. We climbed into the newest model, a car worth more than Mark's annual salary, and smoothly pulled out onto the driveway. Mark and Vivian stood there, slack-jawed. What is this?" Mark stammered. I stepped out of the car, feigning surprise at seeing them. "Oh, hello. Did you need something?" This house. These cars. How?" Vivian sputtered. I smiled sweetly. "Oh, didn't you know? My father owns the wood processing plant. He's also a major commercial real estate developer in the area." Vivian shook her head vehemently. "No, that's impossible. I saw your father in dirty work clothes, with filthy hands." "Ah, yes," I nodded. "You caught him on the day he was personally overseeing the launch of a new production line. It's a tradition of his, to be hands-on with every new project." The realization of their massive misjudgment dawned on Mark's face. In a flash, he turned to his mother, roughly shoving her aside. "You stupid, meddling witch," he shouted. "This is all your fault. Look what you made me lose." He then rushed towards me, falling to his knees. "Sarah, baby, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Please, give me another chance. We can start over." I felt a wave of disgust wash over me. Without a word, I turned and got back into the car. Dad pressed the remote, closing the garage doors. As we started to drive away, Mark and Vivian began shouting apologies and pleas for forgiveness. "Dad, could you stop for a moment?" I asked. As the car slowed, I rolled down the window and held out the phone Mark had given me. "I believe you wanted this back," I said coolly. Mark took the phone, his hand trembling. As we drove off, I caught one last glimpse in the side mirror. Mark and Vivian were in a heated argument, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. I leaned back in my seat, feeling a mixture of relief and vindication. The truth was finally out, and with it, the last ties to my old life were severed.